government's housing policies are absolutely failing young Canadians. The one thing to remember is that a development application or a plan to build housing isn't housing. When we need housing right now, and we let politics get in the way of building more housing, then leads to housing becoming more expensive and less accessible. Hey there, people. This is Joshua Jean-Baptiste, Toronto real estate broker. On today's show, we are going to talk politics. No, we're not going to get into those kind of politics. We are going to talk about how the current governments are completely turning their backs on younger generations and not actually listening to what young people need when it comes to housing in this country. A lot of young people are really angry and upset about what's going on in housing. And we're going to talk about the government's role in all this and how their decisions are going to impact young people's housing, not just now, but perhaps in the future. So let's jump right into how government, and more specifically government's housing policies, are absolutely failing young Canadians. Now let's get a bit of a background on this. So when we look at the overall landscape here in Canada, and we understand the current market forces and what's driving real estate here in Canada. So we have a large cohort of brand new buyers here in this country. Predominantly millennials. Millennials are no longer those young teenagers doing crazy things on the internet. Millennials now are actually, most of us are now in middle age. We have kids. We are at our peak earning potential for most of us. We are no longer those young whippersnappers who are just disrupting things online. We are now one of the more dominant economic classes here in this country, or at least we should be. Especially when we look at previous generations. Most previous generations, when they hit their 30s and now into their 40s, that's when you hit your peak economic times as an adult, right? You're earning your highest earnings and you are purchasing your large properties and you're making big financial decisions all the time once you hit that age. However, we're now become that generation where we've had a lot of these false starts. We've gone through multiple massive economic shocks in our adult lifetimes, right? We've gone through the 2008 crisis. We've gone through now COVID. We've seen massive spikes and drops in our housing market. And it seems like at every single turn, the government just really doesn't know how to address our needs, right? So the government is constantly, at least from our point of view, making policy decisions for older generations. And for a lot of you watching this, you probably share the same frustration I have. Even some older generations who have children and offspring of my age in the late 30s, early 40s, you also feel frustration on behalf of your kids because you can't see them achieving the same things that you achieved at the same age. And a lot of this comes down to poor government policy. So right now we have this war going on in the country between the federal government and provincial governments over how they want to tackle the housing crisis. So to give you an idea of where we're at on the housing crisis, even prior to the pandemic, we were in a housing crisis. We simply just weren't building enough homes or had enough homes to satiate the amount of demand there was in the market. Now, you may go online, you may see some housing bears pull up stats and random figures and things saying like, oh, based on the amount of housing applications, there's more than enough in the pipeline to satiate demand. But the one thing to remember is that a development application or a plan to build housing isn't housing. We've seen housing developments be canceled all the time due to financing and other market forces. We've seen sometimes community groups absolutely take a building that was planned that was supposed to be 16 stories and had 200 units and completely neuter the project and say, you can't build this height here, you can't have this many units there. And it goes from this project where you'd have 200 family-sized suites to perhaps only having 100 tiny little micro apartments because the community fought it. Didn't want to have the height, didn't want to have the density in that neighborhood. Or I remember a few years ago, there was this article in the Toronto Star, I like to call them the density creeps from Yonge and Eglinton, where people were bemoaning a townhouse development that would have created a whole bunch of housing for young families and said this is not in the character of the neighborhood, which is a little funny because when I think Yonge and Eglinton, I actually think young families, but for whatever reason, the community there didn't want to have more young families in a community made for young families, and they completely neutered a development for young families and created these ultra luxury, super expensive townhouses that only a few select people could afford, and it had a much lower density. And I digress. We've had a lot of these issues in Canada, and specifically here in the city of Toronto and in the GTA, for years and decades, and it seems like we've always had a housing crisis due to our lack of building. Now, there's some recent events that have exacerbated our housing crisis, like our immigration policy and so on and so forth. We're not going to get in here and talk about politics and about some of these factors, but we have to still address them, and they are factors that don't necessarily help the mess we're in. Right? So when we add a whole bunch of new residents to our country in quick order, and we don't have a plan to house these people, it just further compounds the housing crisis that we're already currently in. So even if we were to say we are not letting any other people into the country, we are still at a housing deficit, and just simply closing our borders doesn't solve anything overnight. So what is the government proposing then to solve some of our housing crisis? So we hear a lot of, and we can go through some of the public policy, and I'll quickly pull it up and let's put it on the screen right here because the government has actually put it out. And the federal government just announced yesterday, today is April 3rd, we're recording this podcast. So just yesterday, for their upcoming budget, they announced some of the things that they are working on to help bring housing, help alleviate some of the pressures we have on our housing market. And there's a lot of great stuff in here, right? So they're talking about Housing Accelerator Fund. It's a $4.4 billion fund that plans to fast track 750,000 homes over the next decade, which is a big number, and it's certainly something that we need. And then they're going to top that up with a further $400 million to try and fast track an additional 12,000 over the next 3 years. Great. We need it. And then they're going to be launching the $6 billion Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, which has now become this contentious thing. But first, let's just talk about what it's going to do. So it's going to give $1 billion for municipalities to help build the extra infrastructure that's going to be required to build more homes. So you have to upgrade infrastructure. You can't just add a whole bunch of new homes to a neighborhood and not actually serve it with all the utilities it's needed. They're also going to have $5 billion in agreements for provinces to support kind of some of their long-term priorities when it comes to housing. So, like, for example, some of the things they mentioned here is require municipalities to adopt as-of-right missing middle homes. So missing middle, for those of you who don't understand what that is, missing middle are things like duplexes and triplexes, townhouses, and small condominium complexes, so kind of under 6-story condominium. So things that you could build swiftly, missing middle. Missing middle, we talk about it from a scale standpoint and how it scales well into cities, but the other thing that I think is not talked about enough is that you can build missing middle quickly. They are easy to build and they're quick to build if you're allowed to build them. So that's what they're going to try and push municipalities to allow this type of housing and allow it to be built quickly and easily with not a lot of friction. They also want to propose implementing a 3-year freeze on increasing development charges, which is great. The key here is increasing development charges, not eliminating development charges. But either way, it's something that we do need. And I'll get back to that point in a second. Other things like require as-of-right construction of government house design catalog. Now, that house design catalog is from post-war. I don't know how much, I mean, especially when we look at the city of Toronto, that doesn't really help us here, building small little detached houses on whatever land we have left in the city, which isn't much, unless if they plan to pave over parks, which I hope never happens. But anyhow, doesn't apply to Toronto, but I'm sure it applies to many other municipalities throughout our country. And there's other things like the Home Buyers Bill of Rights and the Renters Bill of Rights that they've imposed. We'll get into that in another. Actually, I think we'll have an entire whole other podcast or video on the Homeowners Bill of Rights and Renters Bill of Rights. There's a lot of, but there's also a lot of other resources online. One person you should actually follow who covers a lot of these topics quite well is Daniel Foch. Go follow him. He gets into the nitty-gritty on both these topics, and he probably does a better job of explaining it than I would. And then it goes on to mention that based on this massive amount of funding that's going to go towards municipalities, they have until January 1st of 2025 to secure this agreement. Also, a few other things that they're attaching to this housing plan is that they want to eliminate mandatory minimum parking when you're within 800 meters of a transit node. You're allowing high density housing, again, within 800 meters of those transit nodes. Also allow high density, and all these things are as of right, allow high density housing within 800 meters of post-secondary. And there's a whole bunch of other things like this within there, but these are the main key highlights of this plan, and I think it's all needed. Now, where the friction comes, so the federal government proposed actually a pretty good plan, but now because we have premiers who may not be of the same political stripe of some of these, of the federal party, we are seeing now friction. And not all of this has to do with necessarily what the federal government has proposed. This is politics right now. So a lot of the premiers right now in a lot of provinces are upset with things like the carbon tax, right? So they're going to say, we are not going to agree to this because we don't believe on your stance on carbon tax. So they are going to sacrifice additional funding for building based on something else that has really nothing to do with, or very little to do with the housing market. I know the carbon tax does affect the housing market in some ways, but it's not a direct correlation. And we shouldn't be holding up housing based on carbon tax. And then there's also just simple things when it comes to very granular issues. So right here in the province of Ontario, we have Doug Ford, who came out saying he is against fourplexes as of right, for example, in the province, because Doug Ford and some of his NIMBYist policies and some of his NIMBY cronies in his party believe that you shouldn't have a fourplex in an established neighborhood because they have these twisted ideas of what a fourplex is. They think it's, for some reason, a massive apartment structure that you're going to plop down in the middle of a neighborhood, which is not that at all. But again, because Doug Ford has twisted views of what a fourplex is, he is saying no to this additional funding and no to this additional housing because of whatever false narratives go around having multiplex housing in neighborhoods. So with that, again, we keep getting to these forks in the road when it comes to housing, when we need housing right now, and we argue over ridiculous things and we let politics get in the way of building more housing, which then leads to housing becoming more expensive and less accessible. We need housing right now. And one thing I'll actually kind of go after, I actually wrote down some notes. One of the major things that is missing from this announcement. So this announcement, while it's great for the bigger picture of housing in Canada, it doesn't address some of the things that we need right now. While the multiplex thing is great, and I think it's great on the surface, but it's clearly creating political friction. There's other things that we can do to kind of help bring multiplexes to the cities that need them right now, because you can build duplex and triplex and fourplexes quickly. One thing that should have been included in this bill is some type of incentive for current owners to turn their single family homes into multiplexes. So if you are an empty nester, for example, and you have a 2,000, 3,000 square foot house and you're living there as a couple or by yourself, and you only keep a couple of bedrooms open for your adult kids to come and visit once in a while, and you have all this extra space, The government should actually create either like a tax savings or a tax-free savings account or a tax-free loan or different types of zero interest loans for homeowners to be able to access capital or get a tax rebate to create a multiplex out of a home that already exists. We can build that really, really quickly. And not only that, it creates tons of more construction jobs. Because all of a sudden, if there's a whole bunch of demand by people taking single family homes, turning them into duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, you have a ton more construction jobs. And a lot more small scale home builders can get now into the business of building these types of homes or renovating homes for current homeowners. So that should be something that's included as a part of this. Actual incentives to get people to build, not just a ruling that says, hey, we want you to allow these things to get built. Great. Allowing something to get built doesn't mean it's going to get built. There's a lot of things that people are allowed to do that they simply don't do. You have to incentivize people to do it. And that's the big thing that I believe is actually missing from this. And then when we talk about development charges, in a city like Toronto, development charges are super onerous. They are brutal. A lot of the times when we look at like a 2-bedroom condo in the city of Toronto, you're paying $120,000 plus in development charges alone to build one of these units. The government should actually be looking at rebating that either at 50%, 75%, or even 100% over a 2 to 3 year span and say, hey, for the next few years, zero development charges on building more housing because we need to get more housing built quickly, right? So instead of saying, hey, we're going to cap development charges, say, let's eliminate development charges for X amount of years and rebate municipalities who do rely on some of those development charges to build more infrastructure. But in this bill, it shows that municipalities will be getting more money anyhow for extra infrastructure investment. So how do we say, hey, eliminate development charges for the next 3 to 5 years so we can bring more housing to the market quickly? So ultimately, if there's anyone from the government who's watching this, or if one of you people watching this video and you know someone in government, you know people in government, please tell them that they have to stop bickering about what type of weird bureaucratic policies they want to institute to address the housing market and actually address the housing market by getting things built. We need to build more housing now to solve our housing crisis. And I know this sounds rich coming from a realtor saying, hey, build more houses. But truthfully, that's what we need when we look at simple economics, supply and demand. We have a supply-demand issue right now, and there's a lot of demand, very little supply. So we have to create more supply to satiate the demand and also control some of this the economics of house prices completely out of whack. And it's primarily just due to our supply-demand constraints. We're seeing house prices start to go back up again here in the city of Toronto, and that's without a rate cut. We are still paying really high lending rates, and house prices are starting to move upwards again after we saw them go down when rates went up. Because all that happened is that people sat on the sidelines for 6 months and not bought, they jumped into the rental market or whatever, or they were living with parents or family, friends, whatever, waiting for rates to come back down. And eventually they got to a point where we can't wait anymore. We have to get back into the market. And now we're seeing houses start to sell at a decent clip again, house pricing starting to go up, and that's without a rate cut. So what happens when rates are cut again? We need to build more housing now, and governments need to stop playing these dumb political games and actually start building houses, because this is absolutely ridiculous. It's getting to a point where most young people, truthfully, I didn't want to turn this into a political podcast, but most of us actually don't even have political parties that we can vote for, because truthfully, every single politician's housing plan is complete garbage, and it's nothing that any of us can vote for. So if any politicians are watching this, it's time to actually step up to the plate and actually start building some freaking houses and stop these games. So that about wraps it up. We would love to see all of your comments and all of your feedback. And remember to like and subscribe if you like the content that you just watched. Please share it with anyone else that you think might be interested in these topics in real estate, or if looking to buy, sell, or rent in the city of Toronto or any of our under the radar neighborhoods. We'd be more than happy to help you out. So that about wraps it up. And as always, what we like to say at the end of every video, in real estate, as in life, the next big thing might just be where you least expect it. So stay positive, stay on the ball. Peace out.